Just before I graduated from BYU in 1956, I was interviewed on campus by a representative from the CIA. Apparently my name had been submitted to the CIA as a possible employee by a professor of mine at BYU. I can only guess as to which one it was, but I know there was one professor I had in political science who had worked for the CIA in Latin America. Anyway, interviewed, the term CIA was never mentioned, but it was apparent that that's who the agency referred to, was always talked about as the agency. That interview was completed. I graduated and didn't hear anything more from them, and thought that probably was just nothing was going to transpire. So I married shortly after that, Mary Jo, and we subsequently, after graduation, went to California, where I worked for as a high school teacher near Redding, California. And while I was there in Redding, in the spring of 1957, I received a telephone call and inquiring as to whether I would be interested in interviewing with a position with the agency. We talked it over, Mary Jo and I, and decided to pursue that. So I flew back to from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., and at that time was a four-prop engine, TWA as I recall, and interviewed with the agency. It was at that time, as I recall, that as part of that interview process that I was given a polygraph test, which I hadn't anticipated. And in the polygraph test, among the questions that were asked was the question, have you ever committed a felony? Now, this was on the application that I had submitted to the CIA nearly, about 9 months earlier, something like that. And I had considered that. Yes, I had committed a felony. I'd never been convicted of a felony. So what should I put down on that application? And I knew by putting it down, it would anticipate, it would probably negate any possibilities of ever being hired by the CIA. But I put down the details of what had happened back in earlier years when I was 16 and had stolen the money from the store in California, and subsequently had gone back and had acknowledged to them that I had taken it and paid the money back over a 3-year period. So all of that was history. But they asked me that question on the polygraph, had I ever committed a felony? I put down, or I answered, yes, I had, and gave them a brief account during the polygraph of what had happened. So following that interview, returned to Redding, where I was teaching high school, finished the year and teaching there, and as about the time just before the high school academic year completed, I received an offer of employment. Somewhat surprised. We debated it. I enjoyed my high school teaching, and whether we could have a career in that or go off into the uncertain future of working for this government agency. It was a pretty, a lot to consider. But we considered it seriously, prayed about it, and accepted the proposal or the invitation of employment. Following which, we then traveled from California in our 1955 Ford automobile, and went through about 2 months, 6 weeks, 2 months of training in Washington, D.C. during the summer of 1957. Hot, miserable, humid, no air conditioning in our apartment. Oh, that was an experience. But following that successfully, we got in our vehicle, and by this time we had a child, our oldest daughter, Carol Leslie, with us, and we took off driving from Washington, D.C. to Guatemala City in Guatemala. And that begins my work actually down there. This was our car at the border between Guatemala and Mexico, Tapachula, which at that time was a pretty rough road into Guatemala, but was the only entryway if you were driving down. I was hired as a covert contract agent, which means it's for a specific amount of time, 2 years, in a specific locale, which was Guatemala, with a specific purpose. And the purpose for which I ostensibly had been hired was to organize a student group among the conservative students in the law school at the University of San Carlos de Borromeo, which was the large university there in Guatemala City, National University. So that was the basis of the assignment, at least as I started out. It was to organize a counter the communist student organization, which was quite powerful in the law school. And the United States government had strong interest in being able to offset the power of the communists in Guatemala, because their belief was, their operating premise was, that they had successfully overthrown a previous communist government, which they called a communist government, under President Jacobo Arbenz. My cover story while I was in Guatemala was that I was studying international law, labor law, at the law school, and for this purpose I had been provided a cover letter from the Pan American Foundation in Florida, which actually was a cover for the Central Intelligence Agency under Professor Curtis Wilgus. And just a word about the covert aspects of my work in Guatemala. Under no condition was I to be identified or identify myself with the U.S. government. I was to operate as if I were totally independent of them as a student there at the university. And the university law school was kind of a microcosm of the larger politics for the whole country. Within that school, there were student leaders who were variously identified or came to identify themselves with different political groups in the country. And these student leaders, anyone who was really had student, quote, leadership, typically became employed as a student by the national government political party, or by the Communist Party, that being Russian or Chinese, or by the U.S. government. So all student leaders were pretty much paid off by one party or another to represent their interests in the law school. So it was a microcosm of what was going on at the national level, political level. And for that reason, the U.S. government felt it important to bring more support in for the conservative students that represented the conservative interests of the country, which would be the large landowners, the businessmen of the country, those who had political influence and wanted things to remain pretty much as they were at a conservative level. In addition to my working and organizing of a student group, conservative student group, other responsibilities were given to me over time. One of them had to do with the national elections which were being held at that time, and I was a kind of a courier in getting money to the political candidate for president that the United States was backing at that time. So that was U.S. money being funneled into the Guatemalan candidate for president of the country. I'd been trained in contacts, keeping these at a low level so they weren't visible, how to be careful about who I met with and where and under what conditions. All of those were part of the training that I had received. In addition to direct payments of money by the U.S. to this national candidate at the time, I was also a courier or an in-between person to get editorials into the national newspapers. There's certain of the editors or journalists who were paid by the U.S. government to make certain that certain editorials taking the appropriate side, the U.S. side, were inserted into the national newspapers. And so I met with reporters at times, giving them directly payments, as well as the articles that they were to insert into their respective newspapers. Another function that I was given was to be present or to canvass the country during the elections, checking out different areas as to what type of support there was for the respective candidates for president. And then report back, of course, what I discovered or learned about that support. All of this was going on. While all of this was going on, I also became involved, enjoyed playing for a Guatemalan basketball team. They played at about a post-high school, maybe low junior college level at the time, and I was able to be first-string center, 6 feet tall, playing on one of the teams, and even had periods where I made 20, 25 points. So it was a lot of fun, which I enjoyed very much. At any rate, that gives you a flavor of what I was doing in Guatemala during that period. Unfortunately, just before we were to return to the United States, Mary Jo contracted polio and had to fly her back to the United States to receive treatment at the University of California, Los Angeles Medical Center Hospital. And that was kind of the termination of my work with the C.I.A. It came at the end of the 2 years, so in terms of timing, it was just about the time we were scheduled to return. So that 2-year period was the only time that I ever worked for the C.I.A. My kids keep thinking, pushing me to find out there was more time. There wasn't. The rest of my time in Latin America was in other activities, non-intelligence work. However, about 15 years after that period we were in Guatemala, we returned to I was working as a sociologist with a nutrition institute for a year on sabbatical for BYU. And during that time, I discovered that each of the Guatemalan journalists, reporters, editorial writers, people that I had contact with were dead. All of them had been killed. I don't believe it was because of my association with them. It was just part of the nature of the ongoing war within the country. And it was a brutal war. It was non-declared war, but it was going on. And those were some of the payoffs for the people involved, that they didn't survive. I was never threatened personally. I had no indication. I never was trained for work using weapons at all, and I felt no need of them while I was there. But it was a dirty, undeclared war going on, in which I had just a kind of a marginal impact during a short period of time. Sobering experience. Also, I might add that I went into that situation, into that employment, with pretty much a typical Mormon conservative background that I had adopted or accepted after I joined the church. Not that I was, proselyte or anything. I was just part of the cultural milieu. And my eyes were open. I found out the kind of special interests which are operative at the national levels, the influence of countries upon countries, internally, the role the United States was playing in that illegally, and yet going on. So I came away not so much a cynic necessarily, but much more of a realist as to what's happening in politics and in commerce and in banking and in those kinds of things, and the power that money carries for those who want to have their objectives determined.